My name is Mala, and I am a program manager currently at GitHub, which I'm sure as many of you know is the world's largest code hosting platform in the world. But prior to joining GitHub in April 2019, I had the immense privilege of working for the United Nations and for other various social good organizations in the world. And so today I'm going to take you through some examples of how you can apply UX design and research that's commonly seen in corporate private sector tech to some of the world's most pressing problems. When I think about my career and what it means to work in international development from a design perspective, I always go back to the places that I've had the chance to visit across sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, a lot of the work that I've done has been in public health. If any of you have worked in the sector, you probably know that that will probably always stay the same. And so I've had the privilege of going to probably about 100 health centers throughout the continent. And when I think about what exemplifies digital design in international development, I always come back to this health center that you see up here. Out of the 100 that I probably went to, this is by far the best run. They knew exactly what was coming in, what was going out, how to treat each patient, when to refer them to the hospital, when to say it just takes some time and rest. They knew everything, and they were located outside of Accra, Ghana, about 50 kilometers or so outside the city. And it's not a surprise that the woman who runs this health center you see here is holding a tablet. It seems obvious, but a lot of people don't understand how digital design can be applied. So to start the conversation, I want you all to think about a very simple question. How much money did you spend on your phone? If you're like me and you live in the States, you probably spend maybe a couple $100s up front, and then every month or so you spend maybe $80, $90 on data, voice, all of the things that come with your phone. If you live in some countries in Europe or in sub-Saharan Africa, if you live in parts of South Asia, Southeast Asia, you probably spend everything up front, and then you spend maybe $5 to $15 or so per month on your data. But whenever we think about these terms, we always think about them in absolute numbers. $600, 800 euro, whatever that number is. Interestingly enough, when you go to countries that are low income and you ask this question, even if you're not talking about high-end phones, even if you talk about basic phones, it doesn't come in these absolute numbers. People talk about it in percentages. They talk about it in terms of the things that they could have bought if they hadn't bought the phone. And when we think about the high-end devices, that picture becomes even more stark. On this picture here, you see in the orange bubbles the retail price of the first 10 or so iPhones that were introduced on the market in the States. And so if you look at the retail price, you've got ranges from $550 all the way to the iPhone 10, which was released last year for about $1,100 retail for an unlocked phone. If you add in the new phones that were just introduced, the iPhone 11 Pro, that number goes even higher. And then in the blue bars, you see the lowest 15 GDP per capitas in the world, the countries. And if you're not familiar with the term, GDP per capita essentially means how much money does the average worker make in a year. And so when you compare these numbers, you get a really interesting and honestly sad picture. If you were the average Nigerian, not Nigeria, but the West African country of Niger, if you were the average worker there, you would have spent 46% of your annual income to buy an iPhone 5C, which was the cheapest that was ever introduced by Apple. If you made as much as the average Gambian, you would have spent 65% of your annual income to buy an iPhone 10, an iPhone X. And if you made as much as the average Burundian, you would have spent 93% of your annual income on the iPhone 3S, which is about the same as the 4S, the 5S, the 6S, a lot of the other models. And so when we think about these numbers in those ways, it's not controversial for us to think most digital design in this world is for the rich. It's not for the most in need. If you look at the design positions around the world and the vacancies that actually open up, these are the countries that are most often cited as places that you can work. Same thing at GitHub. We can only allow you to work in North America and basically in Europe. Those are your options. But then if you look at the countries that are lowest in terms of human development, so we use an index called the HDI, the Human Development Index. These are the places where we have the most potential to actually affect human development with design. So I'll do that again. This is where the positions are based, and this is where we can affect the most change when it comes to human development. We see this all the time in the tech industry. It's really reflected in the language that we use, and even in design. So these are some granted extreme examples, but two expressions that we use all the time are solving problems and having adventures. You hear that all the time in the tech industry. But these are some of the problems, quote unquote, that actual venture capital funded companies are trying to quote unquote solve. Customers can't control their fruit juicers from their phone. This is one of my favorite. As a New Yorker, this is definitely my favorite. There was a company that decided through their wonderful research that people don't like interacting with store clerks, even though there's 5,000 delis in New York for every block. And so they decided to take the same items that you had in a deli and put it in a locker out on the street. So then you had to use a QR code on your phone and an app in order to get toilet paper. And then for those of you who live in major cities like New York and San Francisco, you'll know this is probably going to actually not be true soon. But customers currently cannot commute to work by helicopter taxi. It's coming, don't worry. And then by the same token, having adventures. Everything is having an adventure. Going for a hike, eating dinner, driving to work, basically everything. By contrast, this is some of the problems that we actually solve for in international development. More than half of the world's children are born into poverty. There are millions of refugees and internally displaced people as a result of civil war and unrest. And this is a problem that the entire world is facing in different parts of the life cycle. Whether you're here in Europe and you're taking in refugees and you have to figure out how they integrate, how they can have fulfilling lives, or whether you're in a war-torn country and you're trying to get out. And then most, if not all countries, arguably most, if not all, still treat women as second-class citizens. Fortunately, we don't use this term in international development, having adventures, because really every day is an adventure in that field. But the point is, there's nothing wrong with being passionate about the things that affect our personal lives, the things that we face in a day-to-day scenario. But as much as we've all heard of the term the echo chamber, this definitely applies to the problems that we actually try to solve for in design. Why is it that we're spending so much time and resources on problems that really have a marginal impact on the world versus problems that really could elevate the way that the world actually works? So a couple years ago, I had the privilege of working with a few really brilliant technologists, and we kind of sat down and did a deep dive of how to frame this entire issue, if you will. I don't want to reuse the word problem. And the first one we came up with was exactly what I just spoke about. So we have a deep understanding of superficial problems that overshadows substantive problems being addressed. So much of the designers, so much of the technologists of the world are in countries that are facing superficial problems, things that really are what I call minor nuisances compared to the problems that actually affect so many millions of people around the world. And then the other side of that is what happens when tech companies try to get into addressing substantive problems, but they don't have the actual context, they don't understand anything about the country, and so they go and they have a relatively shallow understanding of what they actually need to be doing. So to kind of address that whole second side of that, we did a really cool project. We created this VR experience where we would just chuck pieces of a pipe into the middle of the desert, and so people could solve Africa's water crisis by trying to put together the pipe itself. And you'll see, throughout the VR experience, we had really stupid feedback loops like Ghana green is the most popular color because that's what's important. It's the color of the pipe. So what are examples of using design in which we have a deep understanding of a substantive problem to inform a substantive solution? The first example I'm going to talk about is in West Africa again, in the country of Mali, in Segoy, in the middle of the country. And that's one of the buildings that we did a lot of the research and the user testing. And so the problem in Mali, and really the entire world, is that youth just don't participate in politics. The universal voting age is 18 years old, and so a lot of them feel that if I go and talk to my politician, ultimately they don't care. I'm not a stakeholder, it doesn't really matter. But local politicians in Mali came to the organization that I was working in and asked us to form a consortium to deal with this issue, because they really do want to touch the young people's lives. They are the future of the country, and a significant portion in sub-Saharan Africa, generally in economically developing countries, are under the age of 18. And so they asked us to put together a project to help basically create some kind of feedback so that the youth could have their voice heard. And so the solution was really to build an app that would allow what we called young leaders, jeunes leaders, to go around and collect responses from local youth on issues that affect their lives. The setup of the project was pretty cool. So what we did was we grouped villages in 2 to 4, and then we assigned them to a jeune leader. And then through this app that I designed, they would go around and they would ask people, what are the things that are actually facing you? What are things that you care about? So they would send these reports back to a central repository where they were compiled, analyzed, and then with the staff on the ground in Sugoi, we created a high-level report that was then sent back to the local politician so they could get a snapshot, even at the village level, and understand what was actually affecting people. So, like I'm sure many designers here, one of the hardest things about design sometimes is that you don't always have access to your end users, and that's very much the case when you work in international development. If you are based in the country, maybe you don't have stable internet, maybe you don't have access to the software you need, you definitely don't have a design team, so you're a one-person show. But then if you're based in a big city like New York or London, where I was based at the time, you don't have access to the people that you most need. And so the first step in actually designing something is just talking to people who have been there and have done something similar. And so I talked to as many people as I could who had done similar apps or similar projects and came up with what I thought to be a work of art. And so it was a really simple design, as it often is. A lot of the feedback I got was make it very clear, have a redundant UX so that the bottom nav and then the main nav actually mirror each other. And so there's really, even if you get a jeune leader, a young leader who's not familiar with this kind of work, they know exactly where they're supposed to go next. There's no confusion whatsoever. The report itself was stored on the local device because we were in the middle of Mali, and often you don't have any kind of data available, and so you have to make sure that they can save the report on the device before they get back to a data or an internet connection. And even despite that, we had simple feedback loops to let people know that it was saving, even though obviously on a local device it always is. One of the other pieces of feedback I got was, as youth are coming into their voices and they're trying to express themselves and figure out what it is that's actually important, you have to take away rich text editing because you get a lot of reports that are bolded and underlined and underscored and in quotes and in colors and everything is super important. So we took all of that out and we said, all right, you have the option of bolding or underlining or italicizing, that's it. And only one thing per word, please. It worked. So the flow was super simple. We would start with this text report. If they wanted to add photos, if they wanted to add video or something with a voice message, they could do that, but it wasn't required. At the end, they would get a summary of what they had actually put into the report, send it back to the center when they got to an internet connection, and then the reports were compiled. So, as I said, I thought my app was a beautiful piece of art, and I got some good feedback when I did get there. But as it often goes, the person who told me that I needed to work on my app, how she put it, was a young teenage girl. She told me that she had been working on this kind of work for quite a while, and she had seen something that a lot of people just didn't bother to integrate, and that was the fact that the people that she speaks to speak in a way that, as she put it, justifies a recording. So in the conversations that I love to have, one of my favorite questions of all times is what app became popular in your country? Because sometimes you go to a country and you're not really sure why this is super popular. Why is it that Uber did better than Lyft? Why is it that WhatsApp did better than Signal? And what she told me was the reason why WhatsApp did so well was this little button here. It was the first app that became available in Mali that had a voice message recorder. And so, while smartphones had been introduced maybe 5 years before in this part of Mali, dictaphones had been around for 60 years. And so people were very familiar with recording something and passing on the message. And the other thing she told me, and this obviously makes sense, is that the people that she's speaking to, especially youth, don't speak in French. And so while the lingua franca of Mali is indeed French, and while you can put a French keyboard on your WhatsApp, on your local device, nobody speaks in French to each other there. So why would you sit there and type something with a French keyboard in a local language when there's not an alphabet to capture that? It makes a lot more sense to use voice. And so it gets around a lot of the issues with semi-literacy, with different languages, with cultural context. And so that's exactly what we did. The old interface centered around this text report, the new interface centered around voice. And it worked. In the early days, we really saw higher response rates, we saw more meaningful answers, and we saw fewer errors. All right, so example 2. How many people remember the SMS? 7 of you, wonderful. I don't blame you. I don't use them very often because Facebook introduced a messenger, then Instagram, then LinkedIn, then Twitter, then Pinterest, then Snap and Blogger and YouTube and Twitter and Tumblr and all these other icons that I can't even remember anymore. Everybody has a messaging app, right? So while I used to send, in my early days, 1,000 text messages or SMSs a week maybe I'll send 5, and I get really excited when I see one now. It's like getting a letter in the mail. It's very personal. That's true in high economically developed countries, where we have 1 million apps, we have 1 million ways to communicate with each other. You see it reflected in SMS as a total portion of the workflow. So while SMS may be a critical part of what you're designing, maybe you'll use that to verify somebody's identity, maybe you'll use that to remind them to show up to an event, it's really not the core of what we design anymore. Almost everything we do these days is responsive web or smartphone apps. A lot of what we're doing now is wearables, and then a portion of that is SMS. But then when you look at low economically developing countries, the inverse is true. You go to places that don't have a lot of infrastructure, that don't have constant electricity, maybe don't have Wi-Fi connections available, and so you get very few things that are on responsive web because who has a computer? Smartphone apps are growing every year, no doubt that's incredibly important, but when it comes to digital technology communication, the #1 in the world still is SMS. So the second example I'm going to talk about, unsurprisingly, focuses on SMS, and it's in Burundi in Central Africa. So the problem that we were dealing with in Burundi was a heavy one. So Burundi has one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the world, and so what that means is if you're a pregnant woman, you are more likely to die in Burundi than almost anywhere else as a direct result of your pregnancy. Part of the problem, of course, is lack of capacity. There's not many doctors, there's not many nurses. A large part of the problem as well is that there's limited supplies. And even the supplies that are there are often not distributed in any way that makes sense. So in contrast to the woman that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation in Ghana, who knew exactly where to allocate her supplies, that's not really known in Burundi. And that was one of the problems that we were trying to solve. And so we used an SMS aggregation tool called RapidPro. Some of you might have heard of it. It's a tool built by UNICEF. And what it essentially does is it builds flows using SMSs. So the first question that we asked in Burundi for this particular problem was, is this an emergency? If it wasn't, maybe it was something what we called a campaign. And so maybe, for instance, the World Health Organization requires a certain number of antenatal and postnatal visits for pregnant women. So we could do things like send SMSs out to the women and let them know it's time to come to the health center and get checked out. If it was an emergency, that was clearly the far harder part. And what we needed to do then was to figure out how to build a flow. So how can we ask questions in order to get a remote diagnosis and then figure out if we need to send an ambulance, if we need to send a doctor, if we need to send medical supplies, or if it's something that we can try to help the person remotely through SMS messages. And again, some of you are probably thinking, it's a pregnant woman, she's in a crisis, obviously you send her to the hospital, duh. But again, this is Burundi. So we had 5 ambulances for the entire region of about 120 kilometers. So sending one ambulance 40 kilometers up the mountains is a lot harder than it sounds. And if you send an ambulance up there and it turns out to not be an emergency, what happens to the woman on the other side of the region? So using RapidPro, we built out these flows, and there's basic data checks in there, like if somebody responded that they're 1,000 years old, we could kick them back up to the previous question, we could send them back to the beginning of the flow. So we built out these flows in order to see, again, if it's a campaign, when they need to come in and do something, if it's a flow, if we can actually do a remote diagnosis. This is my colleague from the Burundian Ministry of Health, wonderful, wonderful colleague. And he's looking very sad, as you can see. And the reason is, behind him, you can see about 1,000 or so old books. And that is the record of the entire health center. So it turns out, translating all of those books into a flow is really hard. Who knew? One of the reasons it's hard is because we had 11 indicators that we were trying to track. So think about one indicator and all of the causes that could go into that and the complications of pregnancy. Giving birth is still one of the most complicated things that you can do in this world, despite the fact that it's been around since really the beginning of humankind, as far as I know. It's complicated, right? So if you have one indicator, there could be literally 1,000 reasons why somebody might or contribute to that indicator of mortality. So what we did was we used a prioritization exercise. We had 11 indicators, and using 2 questions, is this something that's a high cause of death or a low cause of death? And is this something that we can actually change with the equipment we have? Plotting those out Turns out there was only 3 indicators. So according to the Moscow methodology, the must, should, coulds, and won'ts, these were our musts. These are where we actually need to start. And so we took 11 indicators and boiled them down to 3, which made it a lot more attainable to actually get to the flows. All right, so last example, I was working with another organization on a project with Deloitte, the consulting firm. I'm sure some of you have heard of it. Deloitte manages this really cool project called Ag Results. If you've ever worked in the sector, you know that everything is really funded by grants. And so you get grants, and often you just give it to an organization and say, go do something with it. Ag Results decided to turn that on its head and said, why don't we do contests? Agriculture is something that is still a problem across the world, and often it's really, really micro problems. It's because this crop doesn't grow on this piece of land, but on this piece of land it does. And so you have to know very much the super micro context in order to get the solutions. And so Ag Results said, why don't we have contests and we'll see people pitch ideas and then we'll fund the best ones. Happens all the time in the private sector through VC funding or whatever else. Doesn't happen a lot in international development. The problem that we were facing is that they built a website about 5 years ago, and it was a justification of why the project should exist. So they had stuff about why this idea was good, stuff about the project methodology, stuff about the fundings and donors, and stuff about the staff and the committees, all segmented in silos. But nobody cared about that anymore. It was a $100 million project. They got it. It should exist. And so what we did was we used affinity mapping, and we used a lot of semi-structured interviews to basically create a common narrative and figure out concepts that were associated with each other, pulling all this stuff out into silos and then moving it into what I called a learning journey, so essentially case studies. And so taking all of this stuff about why the project should exist and pairing it with the stuff that actually worked in the countries, we were able to come up with a really coherent and easy to understand learning journey. And so as the content was built out, it was really cool to see in modular fashions how everything was added to something. And so everything had a place. And not only did it transform the way that the website looked, it kind of transformed the way people started talking about the project. All right. So I use the word privilege a lot, but I'm very privileged. I had the privilege of working as a designer in the ground for many years. So going to these countries, talking to the stakeholders, understanding their needs and building something from it, whether it's an app, a website, or whatever. In April, I decided to take a different direction, and I am now working more on what I would say is the strategy as the program manager for a project called Open Source for Good. And so the problem, or really the question that we're dealing at GitHub now through this program is how can we ensure that open source solutions actually better the world? So again, for those of you who know GitHub, we host code, we don't go out and consult with other companies, we don't build apps, we don't build websites. We build the software that helps people build software, essentially. And so the question, how can we have open source solutions better the world? How can we ensure that happens? Has morphed into something where we're really focusing on how we can help social sector organizations adopt open source solutions to do their work better. Organizational capacity or better programming, whatever it is, how can they use open source in order to get that done? And so we're conducting a large research project, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And one of the things we did was we brought together a bunch of experts who work at the intersection of open source and the social sector. And we basically define the social sector as any organization, whether it's for or nonprofit, that positively advances or promotes human rights, as defined by 3 international covenants and declarations from the UN. And looking at all of those organizations, we came up with a few clusters through our experts of what is actually affecting social sector organizations. Those are education and onboarding, discoverability, data and privacy misconceptions, and then of course a lack of diversity. So focusing on the second one, discoverability, we have a thesis. In the probably 100 people that I've spoken to in the social sector, plus in all of my career, we have a basic thesis that it doesn't matter what size the organization is, it doesn't matter where they're geographically based. When you look at tech development in the corporate private sector versus tech development in the social sector, it turns out the IT department has a lot of power, a lot of decision-making power in the private sector, but not a ton in the social sector. There's many reasons why, and we're not here to argue with how these are set up, but the reality is that when you have funding and you have to make sure that every single penny is accounted for, when you have to make sure that funders and donors understand why you're buying what you're buying, you can understand in the end why there's less autonomy with the IT departments. And so what happens is you get non-techie people who are making tech decisions. And so when they go to GitHub and they see this, they don't know what they're looking at. I don't blame them. If you look at a bunch of files online, how am I supposed to know as a non-tech person how that's actually supposed to help my solution? I'd much rather just go to a pretty website and buy a license, and then there we go. So when we think about the social sector, it's obviously quite big. We've got subsectors like nutrition and public health, food security, disaster risk management. If you work here in Europe, then maybe it's refugee integration and refugee rights. If you work in the States, it could be criminal justice reform, many different topics that you can actually work on, many different thematic areas. And then you've got functional areas, so verticals. You've got project management, you've got funding, and you've got something called monitoring and evaluation. M&E is basically what defines success. That's how I would define M&E. M&E exists in the education sector, it exists all throughout the social sector as well. And when you're going to these countries, when you're going to whichever country and you're trying a new project for the first time, often we don't have the data that we need to really see what success is. If I want to know whether I'm doing something successful in the private sector, what do I look at? Profit, how much money did I make? If you don't have that in the social sector, you have to figure out what exactly success actually means. And so that means you need to hire statisticians and often data scientists to help you define exactly what that is. M&E is a growing field. It's largely driven by people who are young, who are coming in with some tech skills. And so we decided to pick M&E as the vertical that we're exploring in the discoverability piece of why the social sector doesn't use open source. And so for 2 days in September, you can see there, me and all my stickers, spoke to as many people as we could who work in M&E. We went to a conference and we just talked to people. What can we do to make it better for you? And what we heard over and over and over again is that I need to have something to go to my leadership and say, you need to use this open source solution, either because there's not an equivalent SaaS solution out there, or because I just think it's a good idea, or because I think it builds capacity, and why don't we invest our money in our people instead of our software? Many different reasons why, but the point is that if you go to leadership right now, you don't have anything there. There's really nothing out there to help people understand, if you're not a developer, why open source actually matters, how it can actually help. And so what we're trying to do now is build what we're calling like a middle layer between google.com and a GitHub repo. What are the things that we need to actually build? We need to create a basic taxonomy of verticals and subverticals and subsectors. We need to help people understand, where do they overlap? Why is it that Python became super popular in the education field, and how can those lessons be applied to other industries that are now using the same language? We also need to figure out if this vertical wants to search for tools or if they want suggestions. One thing we heard over and over again, and I do agree, is that don't make another list of tools. Everybody makes a list, they're hard to keep up, nobody checks them, nobody knows they're there. Don't do it. So we're trying to think about this question in more creative ways. Is there a way that we can tag all the existing repos out there so people can just click on something and then automatically see everything on GitHub that actually exists, and they can do their own searching? We also need to create relevant content. We need things like case studies and guides that are written in accessible language that people in the M&E vertical can actually understand. And then, of course, we need to define user personas. Whether it's this workflow or some other workflow, we need to figure out how to capture those people as soon as they come to github.com or wherever this is going to live. We need to know who they are, what they need, what their goals are. So we need to do a lot of digging into understanding what the user personas actually are. And so to do that work, the user persona part and really this whole mapping of why the social sector doesn't use open source, we've contracted out a really wonderful researcher, and we're going to be speaking together at Universe, and I highly encourage you all to check it out. Universe is our annual product conference, and we will be on the main stage talking about a few high-level insights, and then some organizations that did a really wonderful job getting around some of those common challenges. The talk is Wednesday, November 13th at 10:30 a.m. Pacific. So by then, with daylight savings, it'll be 9 hours behind. All right. A few design lessons learned. I get this question a lot. What do I need to think about when I design for the lower socioeconomic echelons? First piece of advice, efficiency isn't everything. A lot of design these days is like google.com. You go to the page, you see one bar, you type something in, you hit enter, and then a billion things happen behind the page and you get a result. And then that's the answer, because that's what Google said. But we don't understand the algorithm. We don't know what goes into that. We can guess what factors are there, but we don't know how they're weighted. We don't know how it changes. We don't know what data is actually being gathered. Granted, that's what made Google one of the most valuable companies in the world, but That's not our goal in international development and in the social sector. Often what we're trying to do is we're trying to help people understand the process behind what they're doing. And so sometimes the UI does look a bit clunky, sometimes the UX is a bit redundant, but it's okay, because you're not trying to do something that looks so beautiful and so flashy that nobody understands how it works. Second piece of advice, paper is not dead. My passport is still in paper, my marriage license is in paper. When you go to sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, that effect is amplified. You can build the nicest app in the world, but if you want people to take you seriously and say that I got a certificate, I did something, I learned something, you have to give them a piece of paper. That's just the way it works. If you don't give them a piece of paper, if you don't understand how paper actually fits into what you're trying to design, people might do the thing that you're asking, but they won't take it nearly as seriously. It won't have the same meaning. This is my challenge to all the visual designers, all the graphic designers, all the UI designers, however you like to define yourself. Flat can be confusing. For those of you who know New York, this is the World Trade Center down in the financial district. I was there a couple of years ago at Century 21, the store, and I bought a pair of pants, and like a genius that I am, I didn't try them on, and they didn't fit, so I had to go back. So when I stepped outside after returning the pair of pants, I went out through a side entrance because it was tourist season, and I saw this. And this is the World Trade Center, the clean, beautiful, flat, metallic lines. It's not difficult to understand how something like that can inform the UI, the visual design of basically every app that's in, quote unquote, the Western world. It's really easy to understand those parallels. But what happens if you grew up in central Mali, in Sogoi, Mali, and the only thing you knew was the curvy lines of the Bedouin architecture of that area? Or what if you grew up in a mega city that's super colorful, like Lagos in Nigeria, or New Delhi in India, or Mexico City? These cities are 20, 30 million people each. There's many people who have never been outside of that. This is the aesthetic that they know. What if you grew up working the night market in Chiang Mai, Thailand? What if the only visual aesthetic you knew had nothing to do with the flat design that you see out there? How can we build something that visually captivates the majority of the world, honestly, the majority of the population and what they see? Challenge for all of you, because I definitely don't know the answer. All right, a few guiding principles for designing for social good. So this is a hard point to make, but I have to make it every time. You have to have the humility and clarity to understand the difference between a market opportunity and a societal value add. When we talk about a market opportunity, we are talking about making money, hitting the most users possible, getting the highest profit possible. Usually market opportunity means you can make some money. Societal value add does not mean you're making money. It means you make the world a better place, and that's why there's a smiley face on the map. They're not the same thing. There's no substitute for inclusion. As designers, we have to be the first person to call that out. I mean, this is a problem that's facing pretty much the entire tech industry. As designers, if we want to build something that actually reflects the world, we need to go to the rest of the world, and we need to ask them what they think. So I encourage you all to do that. And lastly, there's a lot of massive social good problems that are happening in the world. We all know many of them. Some of them are politicians, some of them are movements, some of them are just massive inequality, rising inequality. We have the highest global income inequality in the history of the world right now. These are huge problems that we need to be thinking about. And so I don't expect everybody in this room to be an expert in those issues, but I do expect that you can find somebody who is. And as designers, if we go and find those people who know a lot about those issues and we work with them, we can do really powerful, wonderful things together. So that begs the question, how do I do that? All right, so how do you do this work? Personal efforts, there's obviously many paths to get to doing this kind of work, but this is essentially what worked for me and for a lot of people that I know. The first is you have to be very specific with the skills you have, and you have to be honest with the skills. Don't just write writing on your CV if you're applying to a job at the UN or whichever international development firm. A lot of people in the private sector don't understand that while we may not have as many granular roles in the tech industry there, we do have a lot of granular roles in pretty much everything else. And so if you're very specific and say things like, I'm good at corporate branding writing, you're more likely to find something than just being general. Second, and I can't emphasize this enough, do your research. We're all tech people. We know how to use the internet. We know how to find journal articles and news articles. We know how to find people on LinkedIn and other networking apps and websites. Talk to practitioners in your local network. Figure out what topics you actually care about. I love when people come with me to questions and ask, how do I get into this? But I hate when they don't actually know what they care about. They're like, I want to help the world. I'm like, that's great. Now what? Figure out what you want to do. Do you want to work in nutrition? Does education really strike your interest? Do you want to work in poverty reduction or economic empowerment? There's so many experts that work in each of these fields, and if you have at least a basic understanding of what they are, you have a much better chance of actually finding somebody and convincing them to hire you to do this work. Third thing is find worthy volunteer opportunities. UN Volunteers has an entire platform that's dedicated to online and digital volunteers. We at Open Source for Good are going to be doing a ton of user experience design. We're going to be doing a lot of research, and so if you want to get involved, I'll have my contact information up there, and you're more than welcome to get in touch. Catch-a-Fire is a really popular tool in the States. There's a couple others that focus on open source work, and then a couple others that work all across the board. So find a really good volunteer platform and sign up for something. And then if you can, and this, I don't suggest this lightly because I know it's expensive depending on where you come from. If you're like me and you live in the States, or if you're from Canada or the UK, it's expensive to pursue a higher education, but if you can, consider doing that. It turned out my perfect combination was a Master of Arts in International Affairs plus a certificate in UX design. So if you can and you want to take it to the next level, I do recommend at least looking into those options. If you want to do it at work, first thing, find and connect to relevant teams. Most data science teams have at least a couple social scientists because a lot of the people came in the Python community came in the education sector. We have somebody at GitHub who's an expert in libraries. Who knew that was something you could be an expert in, but she is. Find somebody in your company that actually has some relevant or at least tangential experience and start talking with them. See what they've worked in before and how they came to your company. See if you can do the reverse. Figure out how people in your company actually want to contribute. When I first started at GitHub, part of my onboarding was just to talk to people. And so I spoke to people all across the company and I asked them, how do you actually want to engage with the social impact team? Turned out that some people wanted to just focus purely on volunteering. Some people wanted to focus more on the strategy, what I'm doing. And so if you can figure out user personas or really just buckets of people and what they want to do, you can bring people together and maybe start something. And then this is the big one. If they don't exist, ask your company to hire dedicated staff to lead social good programs. These careers are not built in a day. Some of the people that I've worked with have PhDs in topics that you have never heard of, that I've barely heard of. It is not easy to get into this work for a reason, because if you do a bad job, then you can do a lot of harm. And so if you really want to engage in the long term, encourage your company to actually dedicate some funds and hire somebody to do the work. So on that note, if you want to work together, feel free to take a picture of the slide, add me on whichever platform of your preference, and let's figure out how to do some good in the world. Thank you so much.